Let's get started then for this evening. Thank you all very much for coming to our LBNL CAG meeting. This is the second meeting for us of the year 2013. And once again, my name's Daniel Isofano with MIG. I'm here to facilitate the conversation this evening. I'm going to pass the mic for CAG member self-introductions, and we'll get right underway. So starting with Phil.
I'm Phil Price. I work at the lab. I live in North Berkeley, and I'm on the board of the Golden Gate Audubon Society. I kind of represent all three groups a little bit. Sing a few more. Am I blue? Yeah, exactly. Here we go. I think he's almost ready.
Yeah, I'm Dean Metzger, representing Berkeley's for a Livable University Environment.
Emily Marthinson. I'm the University of California, Berkeley's Assistant Vice Chancellor for Physical and Environmental Planning.
Paul Lick, Director of the UC Botanical Garden.
Elizabeth Stage, Director of the Lawrence Hall of Science and resident of Claremont Canyon.
Phyla Rogers, community member and retiree from Lawrence Berkeley Laboratory.
Lynn Aleknowitz. I live and work at the Nyingma Institute.
Carol Schemmerling, Strawberry Creek Watershed Council and City of Berkeley Parks and Recreation Commission.
I'm Rich Sextro. I'm also a Lawrence Berkeley Lab retiree.
Ann Wagley, Berkeley community member.
Len Kubiak, the Chief Operating Officer at Lawrence Berkeley Lab.
And Sam Chapman, I'm Manager of State and Community Relations at Berkeley Lab.
Okay, very good. So this evening, we'll have one of our traditional campus updates for the Richmond Bay project, and Sam will do that in just a minute or two. We also have an update, as we normally do, regarding capital projects that Jennifer Ridgway will provide us. And that leads on into a CAG requested item. You might recall that we talked about how could the community become more involved in some of the visual design and project design review for buildings that are going up in the lab, particularly when they have a visual impact on the community. So we talked about that, and Jennifer is here to report on the possibilities about how to accomplish that very thing. So she'll provide us with items 3 and 4 on the agenda, and that might lead to some further discussion from CAG members. We do have then a report on tree management. That was also a specific request from CAG members to see what is the process and the methodology for tree and vegetation management on the lab campus. And I know Phyla has been tracking that issue and will provide some commentary on the handout that she gave us for this evening. A discussion item, also number 6, to review with you the results of our CAG issue topic survey we did over the last couple months, and we have summarized that, and we can use that as a jumping off point for establishing our topic and agenda list for the coming meetings this year. So we hope to get some feedback from all of you, and using the results of the survey, I think it becomes pretty clear what some of the hot topics are and where most of the interests lie within the CAG. And then we have our public comment at the end of the meeting, so we'll be sure to pass the microphone around at that time. So let's get right on to Sam, your update on the Richmond Bay campus, please.
Thank you, Daniel. So at the last CAG meeting in January, we had just opened the comment process for the notice of preparation scoping. The notice of preparation was the announcement that we would be starting an environmental review process for the Richmond Bay campus. The scoping part of that process was to solicit public comments on what should be included in the environmental review. So that comment process opened on January 4th. The CAG met in the middle of the month, and then the following week we had the public meeting to invite the public to come and give us comments in person. The comment process closed on February 4th. So that was the comment process for the scoping for the environmental review. The next part, so the next step in that process is that we've been reviewing the comments that were made by the public and working on preparing the environmental documents, and that's going on right now with consultants. We hope to have a hearing on the draft environmental impact report in late May. That's not a fixed date yet, but that's the timing we're looking at currently. We would have a public hearing, and we would have the public comment process. If we were to proceed in about that time frame, the public comments then would run into June, and the period would end sometime around there. So that's the environmental review process. More immediately, we have a public meeting coming up on April 10th on the long-range development plan. So simultaneously with the environmental review process, the lab has been working with the University of California, Berkeley on producing a long-range development plan for the site. And that process, we have had general community meetings on that. This meeting will be kind of the final meeting before the final LRDP is produced to solicit public comment again on that plan and to present the public with the latest status of our planning there. So on April 10th at Richmond City Hall in the evening, we will have that public meeting on the long-range development plan. So those are the important dates coming over the next few months in the Richmond Bay campus environmental review and planning process.
Okay, thank you very much, Sam. Any questions, comments, follow up on that one? Yes, Rich. All right.
Have Phil sing again. I'm sorry. Will the draft plan be available before the meeting on the 10th?
At this point, it doesn't look like the full draft plan will be available. We will have a summary of the plan and more extensive information on the plan than we've had in past meetings, but the plan itself will come out shortly after that, I think.
Okay, very good. Let's move on to our third item. Jennifer will provide an update on projects at the lab and the clickers up there.
Good evening, everyone. So I have a lot of things to talk about tonight. I'm going to run through the normal thing that we go through where we show all of our buildings and what we're doing on that, but then we're going to go into the next part about not coming here after the fact, but getting your involvement during our design projects up front. So let's start through the buildings. Okay, so the first building we're going to talk about is the Computational Research and Theory Facility. This is the one that's right at the entrance of our laboratory, and I'll show you a bigger picture of it than this. The artist, let me see, does this work? It's this building right here. This is the gate where you come through the gate. These, of course, are the architect's renderings of the simulations, how they believe it will look. And I do want you to take note specifically of the color, because we're going to talk about that later on. Let's not talk about that right now. We're going to talk specifically about the color of this building. That, again, is the rendering. You can see from the rendering on the bottom here. This is the part that faces the lab. This is the part that faces Berkeley. So just remember that picture. I'm going to show it to you again later. And this is the current activity. This is the one where I told you every time I come for about the next year, you're going to see dirt being moved. This is still dirt being moved. We've fortunately had a lot of dry weather, so it's not, the weather's not impeding the schedule at this time. The other two buildings that are being constructed at the other side of the laboratory simultaneously while this one is being built are known as the SERC building, or Solar Energy Research Center, and the General Purpose Laboratory, otherwise known as GPL. And they're side by side, and the one that's been built the fastest and went up first is the general purpose lab. It has a much larger footprint than the solar energy research facility, and it's the one that Paul sees and talks about. So we call this whole endeavor of the general purpose lab seismic phase 2, and you can see where it sits in the laboratory. And that is the building. And if you remember the last time I came, I told you we had changed its color to this, because these renderings sometimes just don't really portray the proper color. I'll pass this along. This is what we had changed that color to. It is a larger building than the little one that's being built next to it on the right-hand side. This is the solar energy research building, and from the botanical garden, you don't really see this building because the general purpose lab blocks its view. And there you see that. It's called CIRC, and that's the artist's rendition of it. And now this is the general purpose building that you just saw. This was its original look and feel, and now you see how it has actually been built. And this is the CIRC building. We're not nearly as far along on that one. That's where we are right now with the current activities. It's a smaller building. It's an energy research building, and this is the color of the facade for that building. Then over on the other side of the laboratory, we have our user test bed facility, and it's actually called Flex Lab. That's its name, but this is how it was originally put on this slide, and it stayed that way. We need to change that. This is where we took down some of the very old trailers in front of this building 90, and what we're building is a test bed facility where the scientists can it's actually a living laboratory out there where they can go out there and try different windows, different skins of buildings. It's pretty much shielded by the large building 90. That's its look. I don't have any color samples yet because we're just not that far along with the contractor providing me the transmittals for this yet, but it will change. This is an ever-changing building because of the science that's going on there. No one resides in these buildings. It is truly a test lab. Now, this is the construction, the current activity, so let me tell you what you're looking at. This is the big building 90, and then this is where all those trailers were sitting that we took down. This area right here is the steel that's going up for the user test bed at the one end. You can see it, it's right here. And this big round thing that you see are the forms to pour the concrete, because the very end one will actually rotate. So they can do testing. It doesn't rotate 360 degrees. I believe it's 270 degrees. And they've been working to figure out how it can go back and forth without getting all the mechanics and utilities confused on it right now. So I believe they've worked that out, and that one is going to rotate for the sun positions. Now, last time I came to you, we talked about the slide as well. Well, we've had very dry weather, and the slide, fortunately, has not moved. So what we've done, we originally got a rough order of magnitude quotation and an idea of how to fix this slide. But since that time, we've done a little bit more research. We've talked to Professor Sitar at the university, who's had great input to us. We have there are three different options for fixing this slide, and we're going out right now for bid and quotation on all three options to find out what's going to provide the laboratory the best value, the safest and way to fix it, and what are the risks in fixing it. In the meantime, we had mitigated the risk of employees getting injured or any construction traffic getting injured by closing down the roadway, closing down McMillan Road, and also evacuating the folks out of the building that were in direct line of this slide. Professor Sitar has advised us that it's okay to open the road, but we're not opening the road to all laboratory traffic. We're only opening the road to construction traffic to get to the 2 buildings that we're building up that way. And we have a plan in place for if it were to rain more than a half an inch, people have to leave the building. We're not letting people move back in, but we are letting them do critical science in laboratories that we did not move out. So we have a lot of control on who goes into that building, and they all know that they have to get out if it rains. Whatever option we end up choosing to fix the slide, the work will most likely not be finished until the October timeframe.
Jennifer, a quick question.
Yeah.
Is this a slide or an old slide?
Is this a slide?
Is it a slide on an old slide? That is to say, that area, it seems to me that area had some slide activity a while ago.
There was a slide down below, closer to our building 71 at the time. This is uphill from that. That's an abandoned pipe. There's nothing coming out of that pipe. That's an abandoned pipe.
Used to be a water tower up there in the 30s.
And again, truck trips, I neglected to show this to you the last time. I had other things we were showing, and so I did not show truck trips, but this is a recent truck trip case. It's a little bit hard to see, but the majority of our truck trips, the ones that were high in January, February, we're slowing down on that, and in the summer months we will be up as high as 60, but not to the level we have been in the past months. Oh, that was fancy. All right, so design process for new projects. And remember I told you we're also going to talk about that first building that I had presented, because we're going to look at some things for that. So we put together a schedule, a general schedule for our buildings about how long it takes to do things. And I know this is kind of hard to see, but it takes about 20 months to go from what we call critical decision 0, which is defining the mission need, all the way through critical decision 3, which is ready to construct. It takes us about 20 months at the lab to do that. And over that 20 months, we go from programming, where we do siting, massing, and pre-concept, architectural design review, and conceptual design. We have a CD1, which is the selection of alternatives, schematic design. CD2 is where we baseline the project, design development, do the construction documents, and then we're ready to construct. So Paul Alvasados, we presented this to him. He liked the idea of having the CAG involvement twice in this design process. And it's early in the process. First, we need to define our mission need. And when we start into the programming, during that time, it's when you're trying to really program who's going to go in the building, what are the requirements. That's a lot of meetings, a lot of ground floor work to get to a point before you can even get to this pre-concept. So at that point, when we get enough meat around the project, we'd like to come down here and explain what the project is, what the intent is, about how big the building is going to be, what's going to be housed in it, where we think we're going to site it, possible locations, what it might look like, because normally we have an architect on board by that time and they do a few little sketches of renderings and things like that. And then as we get further along, we would come back after, you give your input here. We would go ahead and really start into the conceptual design of the building. And once that is finished, now that we have not gone into design documentation, we've just finished conceptual design. Come back again, actually most likely have the architect of record come back and present, explain the design behind it, the color schemes, where it's going to sit, what you might see from the community, and offer your input at that time as well. So right now, we've blown that on all of our projects so far. I mean, we're building. So it's a little too late to start on the projects that we've already done. But what we are going to do before we really get in the grant or get into the further development of our next projects, we're looking at building and landscape architecture standards. I'm sure you've noticed at the lab when you drive up there, everything looks a little bit different. And you have a hodgepodge of many things, many colors, many looks, old trailers, new buildings. And so we need a design standard where we can say to the architects, this is the palette that we want you to use. This is the look and feel that we want the laboratory to have. So early in the new year, we're going to start developing those standards. Of course, everything is contingent on funding, and I'm not going to talk about funding right now. But we do need a common look and feel across the campus. And also, we've developed new sustainability standards for new construction. John Elliott presented down here a few months back. He's our Chief Sustainability Officer. And so every new building is going to be required to incorporate these new standards for sustainability in the new design. So that also has to be a part of what we design. And then that's what I explained was the early community input process to identify and address the community concerns. So how does everyone want to comment about this at this point?
Okay, let's just get some initial.
Is citing the third level down?
Citing, massing, and pre-concept.
Yeah.
And so we would get your input at that point.
I mean, I think
Hold on.
that a lot of people in this group, that would be one of their major concerns. Yeah.
You want to say it again?
I'll just repeat what I just said. I think that for many people in this group, the siting of buildings is probably one of the most important issues. So
Right.
I just wanted to be sure I knew where it was on
Yes,
that chart.
it's right next to CAG input.
That sets up either the possibility for success or failure, as the case may be. Anne.
Well, that was going to be my comment. But in addition, when you're looking at architectural standards, I'm sure you're going to consider this, but the little square that was going around for the Cirque building, I was looking at its, on the second one, looking
lighter
at
one.
Its reflectivity.
Mm-hmm.
And, you know, I don't think Paul can see it. Okay, good. But
No.
well, because it doesn't
Yeah.
exist yet. But I think that should really be, it seemed really, not that one, the next one. Yeah, it seemed to have a very high reflective quality, maybe that one too. And I think that should really be a priority on your new buildings because, you know, if they're facing Berkeley, they're facing west and
Right.
they're, so that would be a concern with that square that was going around, in
Okay.
addition to sighting.
So I think Jennifer is looking at comments from you about this process
Right.
in terms of
Yeah.
involving you in a more
Right.
generic sense. In other words, you're proposing
Yes.
that this become
Oops, sorry about that.
institutionalized as a methodology in response to the concerns that came up from you in the previous meetings and saying, let's
Yes.
build it in. Let's have a definite, predictable point of interaction. And Jennifer, you're proposing 2 points. So anytime a new project comes forward, it would go through a protocol or process of this nature. So that's the proposal here. So let me get Dean and back to Ann.
Jennifer, the thing I'm curious about is how much advanced information will we get before we bring this to the ZAB so we can do a little bit of research on our own and take a little bit of time to try to come up with the questions before you present this thing?
Well, I'm sure we can, you know, we can incorporate that. I mean, normally, as all things go, if we're getting ready for a presentation, normally, of course, the architects are last minute putting things together,
Right.
but we would already have the data of what's going in the facility, what
Right.
we anticipate it to look like.
But let's make that one
Yeah.
of the additions to this. In other words, having the
put-
information available at each stage, so
Prior
people,
to the meeting,
exactly. So-
by a couple weeks, 3.
Yeah.
All right. Okay.
Right. Okay. So Anne and then Lynn, here, please.
Okay, then I'm not speaking off topic. I'm going to put in a plug for CAG involvement as you are developing your building and landscape architecture standards, because I think a lot of the problems.
Oops, God, there we go.
That
right
there.
Here. Yeah.
So I appreciate that. I think that will benefit you, but I think that we, on the outside, might also want to be involved in that. And I'm sure there are others on this board who would be interested in having input into efficiency and sustainability standards. So, I think I applaud you for developing the standards, but I'd like to see them.
Okay.
Actually, let me just short stop this to say that I just wanted to put in a plug for the efficiency and sustainability standards. I think that'd be good.
I'd like to reiterate Anne's suggestion that it'd be very effective use of everyone's time to integrate the CAG into the discussion about the building and landscape standards, so you can kind of find those ranges of tolerance that you could incorporate. And the second thing I'd say is I would think it might be very helpful to really integrate the efficiency standards into that same package so that you don't find going at cross purposes. Like, for example, with the coloration of the buildings, the darker buildings take a higher heat load.
Yes, they do.
So to kind of work that out in the discussion so that it's not, we satisfied everyone's desire for a dark building, but now we have a building that sucks up, solar radiation, and that's not really great for the efficiency.
Okay, good. Well, let's go back here.
I'm particularly interested in the landscaping aspects. And,
Okay.
Given what we were told last time about tree removal and tree replacement, that sounded very bad, very stupid, putting redwoods on a south-facing slope. I think it's very important that you get...
The lab didn't, I don't believe, put redwoods.
Somebody did.
I think it was the...
I think that was Lawrence Hall of Science.
Right, okay.
I don't care who did it, it was really stupid. And that's why I'm very concerned that you get somebody who knows about plants and also understands the soil and water conditions of the site so that they don't plug in just exactly the wrong kinds of things. And if you don't, I don't know how you choose your landscape architects. How do you choose them? You've got some on the faculty. Do you use them?
Well, so we don't. I have to tell you, we're pretty lean when it comes to landscaping at the laboratory. In my organization, we have a total of 3.5 gardeners for the entire site. So I don't know, back decades ago, maybe Phil knows or someone else in the room knows, we took the approach where we really don't do landscaping at the laboratory. It's pretty natural. And we don't have grass. We don't really, there's one area around Building 50 that might have a little bit of grass that gets mowed, but otherwise we don't really address landscaping.
Well, yet you have that as one of the standards you're going to adopt.
Well,
I'm
that's
very
because
interested in what those will be.
That's fair enough, because we do have as part of the sustainability plan for new construction, there's a drought, that everything would be drought tolerant and succulents and things like that.
Except when it gets very wet and everything slides downhill. But the standards are important, and you have to, I don't know, you still haven't said who's going to really look at
Okay,
and propose these
okay,
standards.
so these standards, so what we're doing right now is we're getting a proposal from an architectural group that the laboratory uses and feels very comfortable with their work. They were the architects for the molecular foundry, and they're going to help us with the standards.
Okay, we'll see what they are.
Okay, so the point is not only in terms of the individual building projects, but CAG members are saying, could they play a role in helping to review and shape the standards for buildings and landscapes and energy? That makes sense in terms of being able to apply it across the board. Anyhow, that was the request. Philo?
I just had a little thought on the landscaping, which I know sort of ends up being kind of the last item on the budget whenever buildings are being planned. But, you know, you do have a wonderful resource at the university with the landscape architecture department. And I wonder if it's even possible to involve some of the senior students in coming up with some design ideas.
Good idea. Good idea.
Once again, that student labor could be
quite helpful.
Yeah, you have to consider the not only the design and installation, but long-term maintenance and operations. But that's something they could also assist with, I would think. That's a big issue these days. People want to understand the long-term costs of maintaining and lowering those costs is part of the energy and sustainability approach. So any other comments from the CAG members? So, and then once again, Jennifer, you're suggesting an early on input round before these siting decisions are made, and then another input when you have conceptual design so you can begin to evaluate some of the visual and other attributes or characteristics of a specific project.
Yes, correct.
Okay, so any other comments on this overall proposal? Yeah, Emily?
Jennifer, if you don't mind my responding to all the questions about the plant materials.
Go for it.
Which is that I when I'm working on things like this, instead of using the talking about landscape architecture, sometimes talk about the public realm, because I think the lab has wonderful natural environment already. Like you said, they don't plant plants, you know, it's what's there. But there is landscape architectural standards usually include site furnishings and how you deal with the roads and what the space is in between the buildings. It's sort of much more than just the plant materials. So I think that will really help think about the lab as a coherent place, and I'm sort of hoping that we get a chance to look at that and not get too hung up on particular plant materials, because in a kind of a strange way for me, the fact that the lab doesn't have intentional planting is one of its, dare I say, charms. So.
Yeah. Okay. Rich?
Charm is another person's, right? So let me ask the obvious question, which is do you does this process incorporate the Richmond Bay campus?
The process that we're going to do here, no, this is specifically Lawrence Berkeley Lab up on the hill. The Richmond Bay campus is a combination. It's a collaboration between UC and the laboratory, and we'll be working on that, won't we? Yeah.
Well, I guess, I mean, just without trying to step out too far ahead of this, I guess, is that some of those same things, the architecture standards, the sustainability and efficiency standards, those might be, we could be useful to you potentially in that area. That's what I was thinking.
You should remember that Richmond has its own CAG.
Oh, okay. I was blissfully unaware of that. Okay.
Not yet. Is there intention to have a community group there, or Sam?
There is a CAG in Richmond, but the CAG was formed in conjunction with the Department of Toxic Substances Control to advise on cleanup at the adjacent site. Right. So there is not a Lawrence Berkeley Lab CAG for Richmond yet. Okay. However, we are deeply engaged with the city of Richmond and the Richmond community at each step of the process, and we meet with the city planning people and the city's top city staff every couple of weeks. They have a south shoreline area plan that is under development for the city of Richmond, and we are working with them in that planning process. So we've had multiple public meetings, and we will have more public meetings. So we're engaging directly with the Richmond community and soliciting their comments and thoughts about the future of the development out there. Whether we form a CAG similar to this for Richmond with Richmond community residents remains to be seen.
Okay, other comments on this input process? Carol?
Well, following up on what Sam said, I was told that the people in Richmond were told they could not have a CAG. And I think that is really a bad thing to do. They need to have a CAG. They need to have a say in what goes on there. And the other CAG that's already there is an excellent CAG. It's a good model, but it isn't wouldn't be what is needed for the kind of development you're going to be doing down at the Richmond Field Station. And so whoever told them that they couldn't have a CAG needs to be chastised.
They have not been told that they can't have a CAG. We have said that that's an open issue, that we are engaging directly with the Richmond community through community meetings and with the city, and it's premature to decide whether we're going to have a CAG there. We're just not there yet. We're still in the planning process. Richmond is not even it's a preferred site at this point. We don't even have a commitment to move to Richmond until we finish the environmental review process. If we were to form a CAG to advise us on Richmond now, we would probably run afoul of the Environmental Quality Act because we have to examine other alternatives in that process. The decision isn't made until we finish the environmental review process and it's presented to the regents and DOE and they certify it, and then it will become more than a preferred site. It will become the selected site. So there has been no decision about whether to form a CAG there, and the Richmond community has not been told that we won't, but they haven't been told that we will because it's still a preferred site.
Okay, that's
That's what we're going through this year, and as I say, it's a preferred site currently. At the time that we complete the environmental review process, make a decision on the site, have the final environmental documents certified, and present them to the regents, and the regents make a decision, and DOE makes a decision, that will be when the site is selected formally. We anticipate all that happening toward the end of this year, this calendar year.
okay. That's good. Good update. Okay, anything else in the design review process? CAG numbers? Okay. It seems,
I'm not finished.
Oh, you have more to go. Okay.
You're not getting rid of me yet.
Right. But I just would further highlight that you're proposing that the whole CAG be that vehicle for this. So that keeps a wide spectrum of interests at the table on these issues. So I just wanted to highlight that.
I have another question.
Okay. Chris.
Jennifer started out by saying that this whole process, the bar down at the bottom is 20 months, which I must say is, having had some experience with institutional architecture, that's pretty, that's aggressive. And so I guess if you're going to have CAG input 2 times and we only meet quarterly, is that going to be a problem? Are you proposing maybe that you would have additional or special CAG meetings? I mean, in order to keep your process on track?
We will do what we have to do.
Mm-hmm.
Okay? Hopefully we can do it around your normally scheduled meetings. But
Yeah. It seems like with 6 meetings a year, it may just work out. But like you said, you could always call
every project seems to be different. This is just sort of a culmination of our best guess.
Okay, very good.
Right.
So let's continue on then.
Okay, now we're going back to the building on the hill. This is already designed, it's in construction. It's the one I talked to you about earlier where all you see are pictures of dirt being moved. So this is the computational research and theory, and this is the original color scheme. I'm going to pass my little show and tells around. This is the majority of the building. I'm going to pass this around.
These are a little heavy and sharp. So
Yeah, be careful. And this is the little accent colors that you see, like in these little panels here, and maybe one or two on the side. The building is predominantly what I refer to as oyster white, and it is a large building. Okay? So remember this slide, all right? Let me see here. This is a proposed new color scheme for that building. The contractor is basically on hold, waiting for us to make this decision. I said I needed to come down here first. We had all the architects involved. We got approval from the client who's going to be moving into this. But the suggested new color of the majority of the building is the third color sample that I'm passing around right now. And the accent color, which I'll point with the pointer, is this little, it's a gray color. I have a few more photographs to show you. So here you see the little gray color right there, a few little accents, but the building is predominantly slightly darker than the oyster white. Oh, that would be good.
So you flip the accent color is now as light against the dark.
This is awful.
Well, that's what it was going to be. Okay? Well, that was the accent color. Right.
This is what I call a sore thumb sticking out of a green landscape. It reflects light. It's like a beacon. I saw this. I must commend you. The new color on the
PL.
is far superior to the
Right.
other. When you drive down Centennial, you see your old buildings that tend to be this color. They're awful.
So I'm going to show you a few more slides here that are taken from Euclid and Hearst and their simulations. So this is our building 50. Can you see? Okay. This is our building 50. This is, and of course, computer renderings are not always right, but this is where the new CRT building is going to be, and this is in the original colors. Phil, did you see this here? Okay.
This is not Euclid and Hearst.
Well, it's near Euclid, oh, excuse me, near Euclid at Ridge Road. I'm sorry. Okay, so keep your eye focused right here, and I'm going to change the slide. So there's our building 50, and there's the new building. Now, of course, this is showing darker because our building 50 isn't that dark. Our building 50 is lighter than what's showing here, and this is a little darker than what I'm showing you on the piece of metal that's floating around. So now we're going to go to a new location. This is Hearst Avenue near Shattuck. There's our building 50. This right here is our building 70, and this is the new CRT building in the original exterior color. And keep your eye focused there again. And there is the new building.
Is that in this color?
It's in the third piece. It's that one. No, you got it. This is the third one right there.
Emily has it. Right there, Emily.
Yeah, what you're holding is the accent. What, Phyla? No, actually, well, they're not the pictures we took, but originally when they did the Regents meeting and they proposed it, some engineering firm took these pictures, okay? And so I just took it to the architect and said, could you just color these in so I can come down here and show you what it would look like?
Jennifer, you should point out, this is a very old picture.
It's a very old picture, but
It doesn't have the new BP.
it's probably 4 or 5 years ago that this picture was taken, but I wanted to get something so I could show you at this meeting. It's the fastest thing I could come up with.
The trees that are in front where those established in terms of like, if they come down, how much more of a sideline are we going to get?
So these photo.
I see a group of trees in front of the building, they're blocking the building.
So these photos represent tree growth at 10 to 15 years. There are no trees there now. They've all been taken down. Yeah.
Well, I think the colors are very attractive. Oh, sorry. They're attractive and they address the concerns of those who object to light-colored buildings. I wonder if you've done a building envelope recalc.
So we had the architect do a building envelope recalc, right? And there was no significant change because of how the building is built. But we're actually going back and having Arup do another building envelope total calculation. And also we're using an individual in our chief sustainability officer, John Elliott, who came down and spoke to you before. He's working with an individual, Steve Greenberg in EETD, to also look at the calculations to verify what's going on.
Steve would certainly know that there's been work in Building 90 on developing, not my work, developing materials that look dark in the visible spectrum but reflect infrared, and so they're cool roof materials and so on. So you don't have to have your roof be white. It can be a darker color, but still almost as effective at reflecting heat. And there are products now on the market that can do that. And I don't know if these are they, but
We're
if
looking
necessary,
into
the
that,
lab
right.
could use those
Right.
in this kind of application.
Right. So that's all I have.
Okay. Dean, okay.
I guess the comment I'd like to make is probably way out there, but I'll make it anyway. In traveling in Europe, I find where there are large buildings with blank walls, they've done some very innovative kinds of things, like painting scenes on them. And one of the things that is going to happen with this building is that from where you're looking, yes, you can't see the building, but as you get further away, down by West Berkeley, you're going to see more of the building. I suspect the cost would be too much, but it would be kind of fun to see a tree painted on the building, a little bit of landscaping on the building, so that it actually does match the background that's there. So it's just a thought. Thank you.
Okay, Chris.
Well, looking at this particular picture, even though it doesn't have the new Berkeley lab building down on Hearst, but it's interesting because it shows the hills looking brown the way they look probably for about 8 or 9 months of the year. And usually when you bring in computerized renderings of new buildings, the architect tends to choose to make the hills bright green. And I think you might consider making the hills be brown when you show us this, because I think this is the way that we are going to more often see the buildings rather than green. And I don't suppose that if you're doing a computerized rendering, it's just a click of a mouse to make it the background one color or another.
Okay.
So is it fair to say that people prefer the darker?
Yeah.
Even after Paul's editorial comment.
Well, I think that since the hills are usually brown, except for the wonderful time in the spring when we have rain, why not have the buildings not stand out? Why not have them brown? You know, Chevron paints its tanks brown, and they blend in with the landscape. Why do these buildings have to stand out like that?
Well, when the laboratory without a standard palette of colors. When the laboratory started with the general purpose, or excuse me, the molecular foundry, it's a far darker color than it's a dark gray, charcoal gray. And then when we went to the general purpose lab, the general feeling is in the gray tones, is how the laboratory wants to proceed. When this particular gray is put up against the light, because I actually took all of these colors, put them vertical in the sunlight, it actually picks up a bit of the green from the trees. In the location that I was standing, there were trees, as well as the blue from the sky. It becomes a quite nice color as opposed to the molecular foundry, which is so very dark, although not a bad color. GPL is not a bad color. It's just we just don't really want an all brown lab.
Why not?
I think
these colors will look like cement from a distance, as they do in the picture. I think that they will. More like a beige is too light.
This is always a tricky thing when you
Subjective.
start to discuss public art and design. There are varied opinions. Paul?
I mean, this is a subject for people who really understand these colors better than us. But a lot of us has had experience. We took your approach of trying to make things brown. It's hard to get a real brown, and you end up having something that's more obvious. Gray turns out to be a very neutral color, especially with this reflection. And browns that you create, man-made browns, are often very conspicuous against real browns that change all the time. So I'm not saying brown is good or bad, but it's a very tricky, color is a very tricky subject.
Okay, Phyla?
Well, I don't really want to extend this conversation much, but but I am anyway. Yeah. But Building 50, for us old timers, remember about 50 or 20 years ago, it was brown.
Yes, it was.
And it was pretty bloody ugly. And so it was a wrong brand. So anyway, there you go. You can't make it all happen.
Yeah. Well, this is like we're prototyping the CAG input process as we speak. So, so we can expect these kind of debates and discussions, but I think that's what we do in Berkeley, and there's a lot of this public discourse around design and issues of this nature, environment, and I think we will learn from it and we'll gain a better result, hopefully. So this is a good starting point. Okay, so thank you very much, Jennifer. That concludes this part of the evening presentation. We're going to get the lights back on here in just a minute, but let me introduce Gary Permati to report on the lab tree management and maintenance process. Once again, Gary was here in a previous CAG meeting as the fire chief at the lab, and so if you want to take the microphone there, Gary, the one that's on the stand, and we can get right into your presentation. Do you have a set of slides here for us? Or?
I sure do. Thanks,
okay,
Daniel.
Let's see. Is that just going to continue right along here?
We're going to try that. Yep, that's it. Thank you.
Did you want this map?
No, actually, I don't. I'm trying to figure out where it went.
Okay, hold on. It should be...
It's the one to the right there. Thank you so much. Brilliant. Thanks, Daniel.
Looks like one of your facilities there.
Yeah, it sure is. In fact, that's our new first. That's it. That's recently completed, and we'll be talking about that here in just a minute. The purpose of my talk is to talk about our fire-safe vegetation. I gave a presentation back in September where I talked about what we did, past tense. Talked about how we've greatly reduced the fire risk at Berkeley Lab over 20 years. A very significant improvement, and I went into some details. I'll recap it a little bit here in a few minutes. But our purpose tonight is to look into the future. Right now, we're trying to do, as Jennifer did, try and get your involvement early, get your input early, and see that we look at the same kind of vision for Berkeley Lab. So that's part of what we're looking towards, is this fire-safe vegetation. That's my motivation here. I'm the fire marshal, and as a result, DOE pays me to make sure that we keep Berkeley Lab in a fire-safe condition. I should also point out that if you've been watching any of the job postings, I will be retiring soon, and I'm working with the lab to try and get a replacement. But this is an ongoing process, and certainly I'll be passing the baton on, and it's been a great ride, and I certainly have enjoyed the contributions that we get to support here at Berkeley Lab. I also had invited Carol Rice. She's been working with us. She's with Wildland Resources Management. She's helped us with verifying some of our computer models, helping us with our vegetation management. She couldn't be here tonight. She's teaching a class to the California Fire Prevention officers down in Buellton. But she will be watching the video, and she will be taking all of your input and coordinating it with us as we go forward. I'm going to also point out that later on I'm going to give you some statistics about this new structure we've got here. Trying to think. First of all, part of what I wanted to get across is a little bit of a recap of what I talked about last time. What is it that motivated us to do what we've done, and why it's important, because that affects what we're going to do as we look to this vision of the lab in the future. The 1991 tunnel fire was obviously a rather horrendous event, had major impact on us, and it was an impetus to us to change our vegetation management at the laboratory. And the area's history has been pretty horrendous. We frequently have major fires. The last one that we had, the 91 tunnel fire, we're talking 25 people died, almost $2 billion worth of damage, well over 3,500 homes destroyed. Horrendous. And as we look into the future, we need to be sure that Berkeley Lab is well positioned so that, one, we're never going to be a cause of one of these events, and two, if we're struck by such a wildland fire, that we're very well prepared for it and we've minimized the impact it'll have on us. We all know we cannot stop those blazes. They're quite horrendous. They're beyond human scale, but we can prepare ourselves to make the consequences quite minimal. Part of what we've done is we have Berkeley Lab is contracted with Alameda County Fire Department. They respond to both on-site and off-site emergencies. We have an automatic aid agreement with the city of Berkeley, and that allows us to help each other out. In the last year, our firefighters, Alameda County Fire, has responded to 137 calls off-site in the Berkeley area. We've also recently completed investing about $1.8 million in that structure you just saw on the first slide. Here, I'll go back for a second. And it really makes it so that we have a very robust structure for our fire department. It's going to be immediately occupiable after any major earthquake, and that's exactly what we need. We need to be in a position where our firefighters can respond. They're going to be desperately needed at that point in time. Their equipment, and their supporting equipment will be available immediately. Part of what I wanted to recap is where we were in the problems we faced. We had flame heights, as predicted by computer models, that really put us at great risk. The best way of looking at this is that if you look at the laboratory and you paint your colors, you really want to see blue. That's 0 to 3 feet as far as flame height. And the reason why we focus on flame height is it translates directly to firefighter safety. What you want to do is keep flame heights below 6 feet. Firefighters can safely fight fires with flame heights of 6 feet or less. You get above 6 feet, and they're at risk. You get much above 6 feet, and it's undefendable. As you can see in 1995, you wouldn't want to try and fight a fire at Berkeley Lab. The only color that you feel comfortable with is 0 to 3 feet. Anything else, 4 feet, 9 feet, 10 feet, 13, 16, greater than certainly any of the reds, frightening. And as you can see, the response I had from the captains, that had fought wildland fires when they came to Berkeley Lab, even when I came in 2003, was no, we're not going to be staging here. We're not crazy. So what has been done is the laboratory has been committed to a very aggressive vegetation management program. And this here kind of illustrates where we're at. This is based on 2010. We're actually a little bit better than that. And we have radically changed Berkeley Laboratory. It's a lot more than you might think, partly because we've left a lot of screening trees. A lot of the eucalyptus have been left in very thin stands, and they help screen the laboratory from most locations where people look at it. But if you look at it from an aerial view, or more importantly, from our point of view, from a computer model, you can now see that most of Berkeley Lab is quite defendable. And this is verified and validated by captains, again, who have fought wildland fires, who now tell me, yes, I'd be more than happy to come here and fight a fire. I'm not concerned. Yes, you have some trees, but they don't put me at great risk. So this is where we're at today, but the focus of this meeting is where we're going. We've taken out a lot of trees. We need to be looking at what's the future going to hold for Berkeley Lab. The comment that was made earlier about the native nature of the lab and its charm, I think is quite accurate. As a fire protection engineer and as a fire marshal, I want to kind of go back to the days, I don't think we can go all the way back to before Westerners were here in the Bay Area, but if we go back to the Spanish days where we had rolling grass hills that were kind of controlled by the cattle, their grazing kept the grass down, and by their very nature, they limbed up the coastal live oak. The problems they had with fires were quite manageable. That's kind of the pastoral setting that we see as a vision of where we want to go with Berkeley Lab. But we want your input. We want to get what you have to say. Yes, we can go to landscape architects and we can try and get expert advice, but it really does help to talk to the locals, people who have tried things on their own property in the area and know what works and know what doesn't, and also know what they like. We need that input. So, what do we have as a goal? We want sustainable, fire-safe vegetation. That's our long-term program. That's where we need to be headed. How are we going to do that? We're going to manage the fuel loads. We've done a lot of that by reducing them drastically. And we're going to avoid ladder fuels. Again, I'm going to go back to my presentation in September, and I'm going to mention kind of the misconception about how wildland fires get transmitted. The presumption is once you get to a crown fire, like we've all seen in the videos, that it's kind of hopeless. It turns out it isn't as hopeless as it might seem. Some of the research done by the Australians and others have shown that you really, actually, Professor Pagney on campus here helped develop some of this. You really, when you have a crowning fire, you end up broadcasting millions of embers, and those embers get distributed everywhere. Ironically, they do not catch trees on fire. What they do is they catch the grass on fire. The grass catches nearby shrubs and vegetation on fire, so-called ladder fuels. They work to the lower limbs of the trees. The lower limbs of the trees catch the entire tree on fire. All the trees go ablaze, and you start the whole process over again by casting millions of embers throughout the area. We know when we did our computer modeling back in the 90s that 2 groves on Berkeley Lab were going to cause hideous problems for everyone, our surrounding neighbors. The lab committed then to get rid of those groves. They're gone. And that's because we knew from the computer modeling that once those groves went ablaze, we were going to be broadcasting into Panoramic Hill. We were going to have problems all over the place. We contacted our neighbors at the time. Our Panoramic Hill members were allowed to use our computer model to see how it affected them, not just from Berkeley Lab, but they got to do a bunch of what-ifs to see what you can do. Having Berkeley Lab as a neighbor is a good thing, trust me, because that kind of ability to look at things from a scientific point of view helps create a bit of objectivity in an area where frequently there isn't. We definitely want to encourage natives. Part of the reason why is natives actually present a tolerable case for us from a fire protection point of view. I'm not in a situation where I'm in the middle of some forest in the state of Washington where I really don't have a good choice. We do have good choices here. The native environment we had here prior to our recent development and the introduction of a lot of invasive species like eucalyptus is actually pretty sustainable, both from a fire point of view and from a cost point of view. One of the things we want to do is keep bay trees trimmed away from the live oak. And the reason for that is we know the sudden oak death problem is greatly fostered by having bay trees getting near our oaks. So we don't want to do that. This is the kind of input we want to keep drawing from the community, from experts, to try and make sure that the plans we have for the future avoid having dead trees all over the place, and suddenly now we're dealing with diseased trees and the problems that that would create, both from a financial point of view and from a fire point of view. We want to encourage live oak volunteers, and preferably I'd like to do something with cages, but again, we're looking for your input. If you've seen better ways to do it, we're all ears. Part of what we're up to, is with live oak, we find them a lot easier to manage. The bay trees, by their very nature, they want to get down low. They tend to spread out. They're much oilier. They present a little bit tougher problem to manage, and they also tend to not take to being limbed up for long periods of time. With the coastal live oak, if you limb them up, they have a tendency to just stay that way. Also, their duff is a little bit more encouraging to keep the weeds down, which again makes life a lot easier for us. It also tends to fit that pastoral setting that we all kind of know is California. But again, I want to encourage your input because you may have some comments about how we can do a better job to encourage the right types of growth. We want to encourage perennial grasses as opposed to the annuals. I think someone's brought that up in the past. The perennial grasses are much better for us. They're much more sustainable, and they don't require as mowing as often. The other thing is that with perennial grasses, one of the things we found in working with Carol Rice was that some of the areas that we've been, I'm going to use the term mowing, and it's probably the wrong term. We're really using goats and guys with weed whackers where the goats can't really get to properly. She pointed out to us that there's areas we don't need to mow anymore because they're far enough away from buildings and far enough away from vegetation that we can actually leave them at their full height. And the reason is if they catch fire, they don't really pose a risk to us. They'll just burn till they get to some of the lower grasses, which are next to some of our trees and won't pose much of a problem. Again, I'm trying to stay as native and as sustainable as possible, but recognizing risk. And if I can keep the risk down, there's no reason to intervene. I also want to do all that we can do to stop sudden oak death, because that's not something that we would want to have go through our facility. This is kind of a good illustration of the lab's vision of where we think we're wanting to go. We've got hillsides. We've got, I'm going to use the term not very technical, crevices. As you can tell, I'm a fire protection engineer, not a landscape architect. The coastal live oak will tend to want to grow there. I don't see any reason for us to discourage it, and it's something that's readily, easily achieved for us as we go forward. One of the techniques that we're looking at and have used in the past over many years is having a protection cage. And part of the goal here is to build this cage, as you can see, with a decently high cage to it. Its goal is to keep deer out. It's to make it so that the tree's got a chance, that it just doesn't become a food source and never get a chance to thrive. Now, as you can see, we've been rather successful. This is over near Foothill, and you can't see the cages right here, but they're there. They need to go because they've done their job. Now we can let them thrive and survive without a problem. They might need a little pruning as time goes by, but again, this is something that we can do on an ongoing basis without large expenditure. And if it does catch fire, it doesn't pose a great risk to the laboratory or to our neighbors. Here's another example of something that kind of an intended consequence. We think it's good. What we've done is we've left our eucalyptus on 20, 25, 30-foot centers. We've limbed them way up, as you can see. We've taken out lots of eucalyptus. You can't see it, but there's a bunch of stumps here. They're not our favorite tree, but getting rid of all of them didn't really make a lot of sense. This made a lot more sense. Part of what happens is with the coastal fog, it hits those eucalyptus. We get drip lines, and guess what happens with the drip lines? We get lots of volunteers. So part of what our presumption as we look into the future is that these volunteers are going to thrive. We've opened them up. We're going to get a lot more sunlight. That as they thrive, and you can't see it, but there's a wire net here. There's a wire cage over there. We're trying to keep the deer away and let these grow. As they grow, with the water dropping, we're going to continue to be able to kind of select which ones succeed. And our goal is to have a lot of live oak, some bay, and keep the bays away from the live oak so that we don't end up with having to constantly trim them back or potential for disease. But this is our plan. As we go forward, we'll see what happens. I must admit, as I go to try and get rid of more and more of these eucalyptus, one of my temptations was an idea that was offered up by you just tonight, which is to paint the buildings. Maybe we can paint eucalyptus trees on them? What do you think? I don't know. Good point. At any rate, here's another illustration of the cages and the limbed up eucalyptus. And as you can see, even if this catches fire, what's that tree going to do? It's probably going to ignore it. It's certainly not going to be easily involved. Here's another illustration of some more trees. This has a little bit more planned look to it. I'm not sure exactly where that came from. It would surprise me if those were volunteers. But as you can see, if that was just a wide open hillside, it wouldn't be particularly attractive. And as the years go by, as we encourage some growth and keep it under control so that it doesn't expose our buildings, we should be in good shape. It's probably worth re-mentioning, just like I did in September. Berkeley Labs construction is almost always non-combustible. It's fully sprinklered. So I just need to make sure that I don't let the fire into our buildings. If it just gets exposed to some heat, we really don't have much of an issue. Here's another example of encouraging tree growth. And this will continue. I've talked with the gardeners. They have explained to me that after our recent cuttings, because we finished our vegetation management in September, the wrong way to put it, the very heavy management that we've been doing in the past to reducing the flame heights so that we can keep our firefighters safe, so we can keep the lab safe. Because we did that major effort, we've been seeing hundreds of volunteers, hundreds of them. So part of what we have to do is be selective about how we go forward. And again, we're wanting to get your input so that if you have any suggestions, we're all ears. Here's another example of how we'd like to have our groves grow. Here's a case where it gets rather dense. And I'll be honest with you, in a major wildland fire, we're probably going to get this grass burning, but I'm predicting you're not going to get much burning of these trees. Even though you have embers falling, the heat transfer is such that it doesn't want to ignite inside the tree if you don't start it from below. And this allows us to maintain the rather California look that you expect here, which is the crevices of the open hills are usually filled with trees. It's usually because there's a water source. At any rate, as you can tell, I would welcome any questions and definitely encourage and appreciate any input. So with that, Phyla?
Did these pictures get passed around? Oh, good. This is, I think, a good example of where you limbed up on trees
Yes.
and you cleared out underneath them.
We limb them up and we cut the grass down.
Right, yeah. I am concerned about the future of the area next to your grove. They planted a bunch of redwoods in there. I went down a couple of weeks ago to look at them, and I think partly because we had a record dry January and February, I'm not sure many of those trees are going to make it. I also very strongly agree about the bay trees. I have oak trees on my property, and I'm trying to protect them from the sudden oak death. And one of the things I've done is to just grub out all of the small bay trees because they are the primary vector.
Yep.
And also, as you say, they grow very bushy and low to the ground. I think if you go up along Grizzly above Claremont Canyon, there are now big groves of bay trees that are like huge overgrown shrubs, and they're very oily. And I think it is a good policy to control the bay trees.
Very good. Thank you very much
I
for the input.
appreciate some of the things you've done.
Excellent.
I can speak from experience. We'd love to have you at one of our meetings at the Panoramic Hill Association.
Oh, great.
Just to educate, there's a lot of people that own a lot of empty land up there. Part of the management of it for a long term would get a better perspective that rather than having trees that are falling over and dying, which are pretty much the Monterey pine, and there's a consistent overgrowth of Scotch broom. And it's very difficult to eradicate unless you're going to actually have people go in there and yank this stuff out.
Right.
We're not allowed in the area. We're not allowed to spray on the hill.
Got it.
So the vegetation management is a big deal to us, but it's also an area where most people that own land don't really understand what they have and how they can actually shape it. We do have some old photos and photographs from the area. Smith Fern Wall was just torn down recently, and there's photographs of when there were trees basically along one of the tributaries of Derby Creek along that area, but most of it was just rolling hillsides, not a lot of trees. Around our whole area, there was no trees, and in 40 years, 40 to 50 years, you have these huge, beautiful oaks. Unfortunately, we do have bay laurels that are trying to compete at this point, and it's very difficult to eradicate and remove them from those groves, but I mean, we're obviously trying.
And I'd be thrilled to talk before your group. Just let me know, and I will be sure to share my phone number and everything, please.
You know, I'm so pleased the lab is still using goats.
Yes.
In a way, of course, they are what I would call job makers for themselves
Yes,
because
they are.
lay down all that fertilizer, and that guarantees new growth for the next year. Very clever.
And part of what I was going to point out is Carol Rice came up in her report. She mentioned to us that we probably need to put in the contract that you need to have the goats spend about, I think, 2 weeks and have clean feed.
Yeah.
And then you bring them in. Sorry, excuse me.
But what I wonder why the university no longer uses the goats. Because I live in an area that's very vulnerable. I live right at the end of the road that opens out onto the Lawrence Hall of Science landscape and the lab. And the goats haven't been up there now for probably 7 or 8 years. And so what they're doing is they're spraying around the pathways. They're spraying something like that probably is a Roundup type product. They're spraying that now to try to knock down the grasses. But the goats are certainly a better solution.
The goats work very well for us, but I must admit that we're a member of the Hills Emergency Forum, and we share information with all the other landowners in the East Bay Hills here. And from what I've learned, we just happen to have a lot of luck in that the lab doesn't have dogs. The lab doesn't have prize roses. There's all sorts of exposures.
Yeah, there was a little incident, I recall.
And it's just, it works really well for us, and I'm thrilled that it does. There are times goats have some problems where you can't tell them, don't cut it so low. They don't listen. But with a few exceptions, they do work well for us.
They've even eaten the redwood bark off the trees.
Please, Daniel.
Okay, so Paul and then Lynn next.
Thank you, Daniel.
Well, first of all, one problem with the goats, we used them once, and it was actually before I got there in the garden, in a 2-acre Baccharis patch. They knocked it all down, and now that is the biggest, luscious Baccharis patch I've ever seen. And the trouble with the goats is you have to keep doing it. If you do it once, I think you do more damage than not doing it at all. But a more serious question.
Yes.
I applaud what you've done. It's fantastic. The sad part is if you stopped at your fence line and you're in the middle of Strawberry Canyon, which I know Tom Kladdis here can really, he's been trying. I have the pictures of 1907 of the canyon when it was beautiful chaparral and grassland, and I think Phyla gave us a talk on this. It's now this Monterey pine, hills of it, planted in the 1940s, has a lifespan of about 70 years. If you do the math, it's true, they're now all dying. And I wonder, with all your work, what will happen if the whole canyon, Strawberry Canyon, actually starts burning? Will it stop at your fence? And can't we somehow take a bigger view of the canyon than just the lab? And it's not your job, but it will be an effect on you.
Yes. Let's answer the second part of the question, which is what will its effect on us be? If we have a wildland fire that comes to us that's a raging inferno, we're not likely to stop it. But we are going to end up with just low grass fires. We're going to end up losing some trees. I'm thinking that because we could be a good staging area, we probably will be able to stop any minor fires that might occur. And my own suspicion is we'll do exceptionally well because of the great state that the vegetation is in right now. The worse the fire is, the more you worry. And I agree with you. And we're all tied together. And there's no doubt Berkeley Lab wants to help its neighbors, but you're right. We're not going to be able to expend funds for Strawberry Canyon. Part of the thing to keep in mind that's of advantage to it is a north-facing slope. And that really is a saving grace. But I think all that buys you is time. And I'm very much encouraging any efforts by any homeowners to take the bigger picture. The truth is if you looked at Berkeley Lab in 1995, it truly was a daunting task. It was, I mean, I'll be honest, it was pretty scary. Even when I came in 2003, I had fire protection engineers who recommended that I very well document my position regarding vegetation management. And the better thing to do is to manage the vegetation. It really just takes a long-term commitment, a vision, and just keep working towards it.
And there were some other hands up, Lynn and then Mark, and Marcos and Carol, and Phil. But maybe you're saying, could the other land management agencies adopt the approach that you're seeing here? Because you're saying, why stop at the fence line? But maybe this is providing a model framework that all the entities could utilize.
We got our private area, we have UC Berkeley. This all is basically
Right.
intertwined.
Right.
We're all intertwined in the same area.
Yeah.
So if we all kind of adhere to a plan, just the same
Right.
that we're trying to build, you guys are trying to build an architectural ideal.
Yeah.
If it comes from your place, people may or may not reject it, but it's from a source of knowledge and respect for what we're trying to do. The ideology behind this is not that I'm doing it for me or my kids. It's for the long term. It doesn't mean about people. It's about something that can be preserved and looked at that can actually self-preserve itself. Bring something to the community for the long haul, not for individuals.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Something that we need a group setting to do, not individual, like your parcel of land protected where you can do about your.
In commenting on that, I'll make this very quick.
Sure.
We are a member of the Hills Emergency Forum, and that's exactly what happens in those forum meetings. And we do share it. It is with East Bay Regional Parks, with the university, with CAL FIRE, EBMUD. It really does help. They all have different problems. I must admit, every time I go to those meetings and I look at some of my solutions and I realize they don't work for everybody. And when I listen to their problems, it doesn't mean that it won't happen. It just means it's a different time frame.
Mm. Okay, so we had Lynn, Mark, Carol, and Phil.
Well, it seems that nature's grass management plan is fire, and that if the model for the landscape is, oak chaparral, that there needs to be another option for grass management. And personally, I much prefer the goats. One of the things that I've noticed, because I'm right on the edge, is that gas-powered weed whackers are used for the supplemental grass trimming. And in fact, I think in Berkeley, they're not allowed. So personally, I vote for the goats. The second thing is really a question, and that is in the vegetation control plan, to what extent has consideration been given to slope stability and how the planting plans have an impact on slope stabilization?
I can't comment that on any of our construction projects, we always include the inclusion of issues regarding slope stability. We always put in like special seating just to make sure we retain slopes. As far as for local sliding, we're talking minor stuff. The major slides, obviously, vegetation isn't going to make much difference. When you have something moving 30, 40 feet below the surface, it doesn't matter what you do. But for the local stuff, we do include that in our considerations.
So you're saying that it's not really managed on a site-wide basis, but more on a building-by-building basis, and the local impacts of specific project?
The slides or the
Slope
vegetation?
stabilization, through vegetation, and what's the impact of taking out big trees on, sort of slopes?
The slides are managed as a laboratory-wide kind of thing, which is obviously something we've spent a lot of resources to try to get this year because the Wilson so-called Wilson slide. But I don't know exactly. I mean, Gary summarized that some of the slide planes and some of these ancient slides, and we have photographic evidence that goes back to the 20s and the 30s, that some of these slides existed then and well before then. And some of them have considerable depth. And so the vegetation that you plant in those particular unstable areas isn't going to help you much because they're...
Yeah, no, I wasn't really talking about those.
Oh.
But, there are situations where just the local surface slopes are very vulnerable to sliding because they have such steep angles of repose. And to what extent that...
In those, I'm calling it just the surface type, sliding type things, nothing major, but we do consider it whenever we do anything. I also have recently been changing the way in which we cut our grass for just that reason. It's the goats, actually, which we greatly encourage, that can be the worst culprit, because if they eat it too low, you end up with a concern with a wet winter. But it's manageable. It takes effort. You're going to be out there managing them anyhow. You just need to manage them off the land a little bit quicker so that they don't...
Right. Right. Okay, so we have Mark, Carol, and Phil next.
So most of the question that I had has been answered in the last 5 minutes, but one thing remains for me, and that is you mentioned that a number of the other land management authorities or fire management authorities that you periodically confer with.
Yeah, the Hills Emergency Forum, correct.
That they seem to have, each of them has somewhat modestly or very differently, different set of priorities. And that makes it difficult to coordinate. And I'm just curious as to if you could give 2 or 3 examples of different set of priorities.
Sure. Some of the members of the Hills Emergency Forum are like fire departments, so they really don't manage it. But for what you just said, what you're going to find is East Bay Regional Parks District is very much tied in with the public. They deal with very different constraints than we do. East Bay Mud, again, they have a different perspective as to what they want to do. It's not that, what's the word for it? The forum is an excellent place for us to share what's worked for us and what hasn't and why. And what you find out is when we talk to each other, we find out that some things that work great for us just are unthinkable for them. And it's simply because you realize, oh, geez, that would be really tough. The Oakland Fire Department, which manages their own hillside tax district, they have a whole bunch of problems that we don't, and they also have some advantages. Frankly, for them, using weed whackers makes lots of sense, but they're working right next to a roadway. We actually like the idea of not having anything that's sparking. you worry what somebody might end up doing with his gas weed whacker. You don't want to cause the problem in the first place. But the point is everybody has different kinds of problems. With the Oakland situation, frequently they're working right next to a roadway. Changes things. It's not that we can't coordinate. It turns out we have very different challenges. Yeah. Sharing the information turns out to be exceptionally useful.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Carol, what's next?
I hope that whoever comes after you retire does as good a job as you've done. I think that from what you've said, your protocols are absolutely right on for the situation that you have up there. I also wanted to mention that I went to a meeting a few years back with FEMA and the East Bay Regional Park District, and talking about what to do, about fire and other things. And one of the gentlemen was from Spain, who is involved with FEMA. Mm-hmm. And when I pointed out to him that I was shocked to see in northern Spain whole mountainsides planted with eucalyptus, he said, "Don't be prejudiced. It works very well for us." And so what you've done with culling, I would imagine the smaller eucalyptus and pruning them up is a very, very sound way to go. And as long as you can get bunch grasses growing, and rather than the European rye, annual rye, you're saving a lot of trouble. So I congratulate you for what you've done.
Thank you, Carol, for the kind words.
Okay. Thank you. Phil is next.
I also am pleased. I work at the lab, and I've seen over 20 years this process gradually happening. I've been worried that it was going to go too far, so I am encouraged that you're not planning on continuing to remove oaks and so on. But I wonder about the timing. So speaking not from a fire management plan, but from as someone who's interested in birds and wildlife and represent an organization that is also interested, we'd much prefer to see as much tree trimming as possible done in the fall. So the spring and the summer, you can have birds nesting and not be cutting down and killing baby birds. Do you do that, or is that the kind of thing you could do? You try to do as much of the other kind of work, building and removing the cages and other kinds of maintenance work in the spring and summer, and defer as much of the limbing of trees into the fall? Do you do that now, and is that something you could do?
Right. My understanding, and I apologize for not having it immediately in memory, there are some tasks we put off until August, I think, July and August, for just that reason, certain habitats, bird habitats, and we do surveys. It turns out that's, I don't want to say problematic, it makes it so we can just get it done. Sure. There's also a flip side, which is the financial aspect, which is our end of budget year is September 30th. And while we're thrilled that DOE gives us this money and lets us protect this vital asset of Berkeley Lab, it also disappears on September 30th. And so we always end up with that end of year. It makes us want to do our vegetation management at the very end of the year. It turns out that won't be a problem in the future because our major expenditures are done. Glenn is going to hold me to that.
For trees.
Yes. Yeah. Well, yes. For vegetation management, we're now going to go into a maintenance mode. We're going to be trying to encourage native growth. The things we're going to be doing are not going to be large sums of money. If it turns out that our bird, checks tell us that we need to be doing something at a different time of the year, yes, we will do it. And we have a history of doing that when it comes to some of the nesting birds where we did hold off until doing July work. I think it even went into August before we could get started, just because we didn't want to disturb them.
Terrific. Thank you very much.
Sure.
Okay, maybe last one, and we'll move to our final item.
Just a quick comment on the history of these slides. I recently received a very, very high resolution panoramic view of the canyon taken in 1906 at the Stute Dairy Farm. I can't quite locate the exact location. It was on the USGS site, and the reason it was there is there was a huge landslide in the canyon at that time that they made a big deal out of. You can see this big cut.
Okay, Gary, thank you very much.
Thank
well
you so
done.
much, Daniel.
And
I'll pass this off.
why don't you just leave it there with Sam? You can switch it off if you don't mind, Sam. Thank you.